Welcome to the Christian in Name Only podcast. I am Pastor Kristen Worthen.
I'm Reverend Tim Schaefer.
And we are here today talking about something we know you have all heard about by now, and that is Project 2025. We've seen the TikToks, we have read the blogs, we have heard all of the fear and resistance associated with it. What we may not know is why it actually poses a threat. And so that's what we're up to today. We're going to talk about what our faith might have to say to Project 2025 and why we should concern ourselves with it. So let's get started by hearing what some of it sounds like.
In the chapter on the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, it says healthy marriage and relationship education grants, which provide federal funding for relationship counseling to school and community groups, should be given to organizations that exclusively promote heterosexual relationships. Accountable.us, a nonpartisan research organization that investigates the influence of special interest groups on government policy, says Project 2025 also includes other policies that are anti-LGBTQ+, including limiting the application of sex discrimination protections for LGBTQ+ people, having the Department of Justice defend religious freedom rights over the rights of LGBTQ+ people in discrimination cases, and rolling back some federal LGBTQ+ equity programs.
We do have to initiate the largest mass deportation project in the history of this country. The 12 million people who've come in as illegal aliens must be sent back to their native countries.
First, I will immediately reissue my 2020 executive order restoring the president's authority to remove rogue bureaucrats, and I will wield that power very aggressively.
That first clip was a policy analysis of Project 2025's focus on defining family, especially within the Department of Health and Human Services. And it is a definition of family that promotes exclusively heterosexual relationships and goes a little bit further and defines it as the ideal family structure being one man, one woman, and children. The second clip was Kevin Roberts, who is the president of the Heritage Foundation, talking about the mass deportation of undocumented immigrants, which is part of this plan. And he, of course, refers to them as, quote, illegal aliens. And then the third clip was former President Trump talking about reinstating Schedule F, which he did in his first term by executive action and was then dismantled by the Biden administration. But he wants to bring Schedule F back, which would allow the president to replace federal employees that disagree with their administration's policies and replace those employees with those who are who have passed a loyalty test, who will be loyal to the president's agenda. And so, Kristen, as I often do at the beginning of these, I want to ask you for your initial gut reaction to these video clips.
So much about this is disturbing, right? First of all, stripping down the rights of LGBTQ plus persons. Listen, I am someone who is in what they consider to be the preferred family dynamic. I am, one woman married to one man, and we've got 2 kids and 2 dogs and a cat. And look at us in our white picket fence. But my right to my family and my loving relationship and my spouse's insurance, should anything happen to him, and all that comes along with that is no greater than your right to your spouse's, right? And it's no greater than your right to parent your children, should you ever choose to have them. And so, oh my gosh, to give preferential treatment to my deeply held religious belief over your right to live and exist and flourish is incredibly troubling to me. I think that lays the foundation for what becomes terrorism, honestly. That's just one of those issues, right? When we start talking about mass deportation, the U.S. does not have a strong history. When we've tried to implement that, it does not bode well for us. The world does not have a good history when other countries have tried to implement it. It does not bode well. And then, who determines what a rogue bureaucrat is? That sounds like a character in a board game.
Yeah. I think what struck me about all of those clips is it's really clear that the goal is to consolidate power. Mm-hmm. The goal is to work through certain government agencies to define policies. In some cases, the goal is to dismantle certain agencies to make controlling whatever it is, right? In one instance, I know the Department of Education is a target for this plan that would be totally eliminated to control what our children are taught. And it would be easier without a Department of Education interfering in that or pushing back against that. And even the idea of replacing employees that might stand in the way of a particular agenda, who might disagree, who might push back, who might say, I actually have to follow the law here and I can't implement that, right? I mean, I'm thinking in particular, how does this impact the military? When military officers say, no, for example, a president cannot say that we must go out and assassinate a citizen or really do any action on U.S. ground against our own citizens. And if that officer stands against that, right, for the Constitution, of course, right, their responsibility not to engage in this activity, but they stand against a president who orders them to do something illegal, and that person can just be replaced with someone who has taken a litmus test, who has said, yeah, I agree with you on all of these things, and I will do whatever you tell me to do.
Absolutely.
Just all about consolidating power. And that really scares me.
Well, and even, Tim, beyond consolidating power with regards to having yes men in office, it's a removal of checks and balances, because when they talk about de-weaponizing the federal government by holding the DOJ and FBI accountable, that's a consolidation of power too. Those are two agencies that create some checks and balances within the federal government, within our system of justice that we need in place. They protect the people. And using the language of, no, the people elected us, so these folks need to answer to us entirely, they're removing some checks and balances there.
Yeah, for sure. For those who might not be as familiar with Project 2025, and it's been in the news a lot, it's been, as you mentioned already in the intro, it's been all over TikTok and other social media as well. There are some people who do a really good job of providing some analysis on that. I want to to level set, just make sure that we have an idea of what it is. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about what I found out in some of my research as we were preparing for this episode. So Project 2025 is a 920-page document, which sounds just bonkers. And it is essentially a blueprint. It's a blueprint for a future presidential administration to implement an ultra-conservative agenda. And some have referred to it as essentially a government in waiting. And it was primarily authored by the Heritage Foundation, which has been around for a little while. It's a kind of conservative think tank. And they claim that it was, or it is, backed by more than 100 conservative organizations and had, get this, Kristen, a $22 million budget to create this plan.
I want that kind of a budget to write a book.
Can you imagine?
I mean, the book we could write. By the way, Les Miserables is also a 900+ page book.
Oh, I didn't know that, but I would prefer that 900+ page piece of work than this piece of work. I want to just mention this, kind of how this breaks down too, because there's these sort of 4 fundamental parts to this Project 2025, 4 pillars, if you will, or that's what they call them. Mm-hmm. The first is a policy plan, and it really talks about dismantling what they call the administrative state, purging various departments and reforming them and tying their hands, right? The second piece of that is a personnel database. And so some have referred to it as a conservative networking platform. And so apparently this has already been set up, Kristen, this personnel database. And there are already hundreds or possibly even thousands of people in this database, and they fill out these questionnaires to apply for these federal jobs. And they ask questions about people's personal feelings on issues like immigration and family values. And so it's essentially a litmus test. And so then the goal of this platform is that when certain employees are fired from their positions because they don't agree with the administration's policies, they have somebody that they know will be, as you said, a yes man to fill that role and to fill it quickly, right? So they have this database already to choose from when as soon as this can be implemented. And then they go from that second pillar, that database, to the third, which is an online academy, which then provides training for those employees that are hired to essentially teach them what they should and shouldn't do. And then the last part of that, the fourth pillar, is a presidential playbook. And really what that says is, here in the first 100 days, here is the playbook for any president coming into office that wants to implement this plan. And here is the most effective way to do that. And I want to just stress, and one last thing I want to say about this is that these kinds of strategy plans are not uncommon. Both parties have implemented them in the past, and they draft these plans of like, what will we implement when we're in office? But a lot of commentators on this have said this is by far the most comprehensive plan, and it would substantially overhaul our government in a way that plans have not done in the past. And it wouldn't just have impact during a single presidential term, but these are really lasting changes that would take generations to undo or dismantle if it were ever put into place.
Well, yeah, I mean, it doesn't feel like a dismantling of like where we are right now. It's one thing to want change. Listen, progressive, conservative, middle of the road. Like, I think if there's one thing every American can agree on as we head into election season, one thing we all fundamentally want, it's change, some kind of change. We want to see our country function better for us and for our families and for the people that we love. And that's every voter throughout time. That's why we vote. But this, as we look at this is not just a dismantling of the situation as it is now. This is a dismantling of the foundation of our government. Their basic proposition, by giving people of faith the upper hand, people of faith the preference, that in and of itself disrupts the foundation of the nation. We've got to remember, we were not a Christian nation in our founding. We were founded so that people of all faiths could practice their faith without their government interfering. Just that whole notion of giving preference to people of faith. And then I would even argue a particular people of faith, because I don't see that there's room in Project 2025 for clergy or churches or people of faith who would say that LGBTQ lives are just as valuable to God, and that God created LGBTQ persons as they are and calls them beloved, period.
Yeah. Two things that you bring up. The first is about our founders, and I would point out that, you know, a lot of people will make that argument that America is a Christian country because many of our founding fathers were Christians. But the reality is that they may have had their faith. That does not mean just because they were people of faith that what they wanted was that faith to rule everything. In fact, it was very much the opposite.
Right.
And most likely because they were not so far removed from their own faiths, having been persecuted in other countries where they came from. And that was not the kind of system that they wanted to establish here in this new country, that this was going to be a religiously pluralistic society. At least that's what some wanted. The second thing I want to point out is you're absolutely right. I mean, there is so much room for disagreement on the interpretation of scriptures, as we've talked before about, especially in our first episode. When I look at the Heritage Foundation's articulation of these values based on Christian principles, I just want to say I dissent, right? There are many of us who are not at all there. And on issues like, well, what is an ideal family unit? what I think is so interesting about what they're saying is that this isn't actually just an attack on LGBTQ people. It is also an attack on couples with no children. And a lot of the rhetoric lately about, well, people who don't have children don't have a real stake in the future of this country and therefore should not make decisions about its direction is total crap. I mean, in the Bible, there is no ideal model of a family unit. There just is not. And so I don't know where they get that from, but I can respect that we can disagree on that and have some issues, especially as it relates to same-sex relationships. There are some passages where I can see why people would disagree. The one thing that I want to just say, this is the last thing on this, I just do not see how you can possibly disagree is on immigration. Nowhere in the Bible does it say treat the foreigner like crap. It just does not. There are so many passages that say just the opposite. So I don't understand how you can even remotely get anywhere from the Bible that you should not treat immigrants well.
Especially when we're telling the story in scripture of a people who were the immigrant over and over and over again. And how has Western Christianity spread, Tim? We have sent missionaries into foreign countries as, wait for it, immigrants, foreigners who live amongst you.
Not to mention, can we just call out the hypocrisy of the fact that the people who are calling for mass deportations are themselves immigrants to this country? Maybe not they themselves, but their ancestors for sure at some point were immigrants to this country.
You are absolutely correct about immigration. And I brought up earlier, our history with this is not good. The last time the U.S. had any kind of a mass deportation event or policy was under, I think it was Eisenhower in the 50s. And they called it Operation Wetback. They named it. I did not. That is a horrifying name. But it was Operation Wetback. And they deported over 1 million Mexicans, many of whom were citizens. They went into their homes, military style, took them out of their homes, sent them back to Mexico, and many of them were American citizens. This is just legalese for racism.
Yeah. Well, and what's really dangerous is that you're hearing some rhetoric also. It's not necessarily explicitly in Project 2025, but related to this is also talk, and Donald Trump has said this himself, of eliminating birthright citizenship. And talking about even coming up with a process of revoking people's naturalization. So somebody like me who is a naturalized citizen who was not born here, what does that mean for me who has, quote unquote, gone through the legal process? And I'm putting that in air quotes because it really bothers me when folks say, well, I came here legally. Well, you know, you had all the privileges of doing that probably because of where you came from and the color of your skin. And it is not that easy necessarily for everybody because the immigration process is difficult no matter who you are, I can say from experience.
And that's before you get to issues of time not being on your side.
Yeah, exactly right. Well, I mean, when you came, right, it's much harder now than it was in the, let's say, early 90s when my family came here. To have gone through that process, to have become a naturalized citizen, you are now an American citizen. And to say, no, we can just, if we want to, undo that because what? We don't like your politics. We don't like what you publicly say. We don't like that you're speaking out against this presidential administration. I mean, it really smacks of authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, give us the power. Give us the power. Put us in office. We'll take care of everything. Like, the more you centralize that power, I mean, we all know what they say. Power corrupts.
Yeah. And I want to say, Kristen, as a little teaser, that, of course, we have an entire episode coming up on immigration that has already been recorded, and that will become our third episode. And so just a little teaser that in a couple of weeks, you can catch that.
Mm-hmm. Love it. Yeah, I think the whole premise of Project 2025, the more I read and the more I think about what each individual piece can do, and how the web weaves together, the more I see it as something that puts power squarely back to wealthy, white, landowning, cisgendered, heterosexual men.
Mm-hmm.
Listen, I'm not saying we don't need to have a good conversation in this country around power and authority. That has been a robust conversation we have had since our founding. Like, we'll remember, for all that Lin-Manuel Miranda made Hamilton popular, when you read about Hamilton, he was actually quite suspicious of the common man. He feared giving common, he would say uneducated people, too much voice and authority. This has been a conversation we have been having since our founding. We need to have it. We need to have it while maintaining our rights. We need to have it while guaranteeing that people, all people, men, women, straight, gay, trans people, Christian and non-Christian, atheist and agnostic, all of us have our fundamental basic rights, whether we are white, black, brown, all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then we need to be looking and asking ourselves whose voices we are not hearing because we've drowned them out.
Mm-hmm.
Because we've got to hear those voices.
Yeah.
And Project 2025 silences them.
Yeah, it reads like a manifesto in some ways, right? And says these are the values we have decided, whoever this we is, I guess Heritage Foundation, and uses that religious language, again, manipulates, I think, faith, and rallies people around really giving up, in my opinion, giving up their own rights.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know that people understand that voting for let's say a presidential candidate that would be willing to or consider implementing this strategy is really voting against their own interests.
Yeah.
It may sound really exciting to be like, hey, this person is going to force their beliefs, the beliefs I share, on everybody else. And that's fine until you disagree with the policy. And, well, you know what? Your power to express that difference has been taken away.
Mm-hmm. When we think about consolidating power, we have to remember that one of the ways we look after the common good is by using our voices and having checks and balances and having policies in place that reflect the best. They don't always work for the best. Like, it's a flawed system. We're humans and we human really well. But we've got to have those systems in place that look at and force those in power to look at the common good. And the more you consolidate power into an office and take it away from the grassroots, the less likely you are to have your good looked after.
I'm trying to think, Kristen, I can't think of any examples. Can you think of any examples of a situation where the person whose essentially rallying cry was "give me more power," where that ever ended well?
Oh, no. Not even in scripture, right? Like even like, look, no, not even in scripture. You got a whole Joshua and Judges, the book of Judges, the people It's all about why they need a king. The people have asked God for a king and asked God for a king and asked God for, give us someone to lead, give us someone to guide, give us. And God says, I'm telling you, you don't want this. You don't want this. I'm telling you, I promise you don't want this. And so we've got the book of Judges, which is a polemic about why we need a king. Look at all the terrible, horrible things that happen when the people are left to themselves, right? Playing on our fear. Does that sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, they get a king. Well, what do the kings do? They exploit their people. They see women bathing and decide they can take them as their own. So we've got exploited people, exploited women, nations that go to war for, I don't know, a little more land here, a little more land there. It's all about the power. So no, because it becomes about what that person as leader can do. And they never separate themselves from their kingdom. They see themselves as the kingdom, and everyone within the kingdom serves them.
Yeah. And I've been wrestling with this a bit, right? And I recognizing that no party, no person is perfect, as you said earlier. We're human. We're all human. And no matter who we elect, they're not going to be perfect in office. But I am struck by this stark difference in the arguments that our two major candidates are making right now as they're running. One is saying, give me all of this power. The other is saying, I'm focusing on building up people, right? It's a totally different rhetoric. And I just don't understand the draw that some people have to this strongman argument. That's I alone can fix everything and make everything the way that you want it.
I need a hero.
I guess.
I think one of the things, you've watched Bad Faith. You're the one who recommended me to watch it. But what's fascinating is I love the line in there. You think that the church is trying to encroach upon the political realm. But what has actually happened is political action committees got the names of people involved in these movements, and they came into the church and made it a religious issue. So that now we have this Christian nationalism that has run rampant, where we think our faith and our government has to be so enmeshed as to not be able to tell one apart from the other, which is essentially what Christian nationalism seeks to do. It started with people learning that if they could speak the language of faith, they could get people to vote their way. This is a vocabulary issue. I'm getting into my little English nerd, my word nerd mode, but it's a vocabulary issue where there are words, there are phrases, there are ideas that have literally been hijacked and morphed and redefined over the years. They got that language. They got in there and said, what do religious folk value? Now, what do they fear? And let's make everything about our nation, when we talk about it, all the things that they fear, and we have the solution. We've got the safety for you. We've got the security for you. We've got the real freedom for you.
You talked about the documentary Bad Faith, and I wanted to bring another point up, which is, first of all, yes, it is an excellent documentary, but two things I find really interesting about that is it chronicles the sort of most recent rise of Christian nationalism. And what organization is at the core of what you described? The Heritage Foundation, which really came to power and prominence because they utilized that religious language to get people to vote how they wanted. And they got in bed with the political system. They used voter data to target people. And that was really the beginning, I think, of this slow merging of at least one of our political parties and sort of the religious right. And we're still living with that now. And of course, their latest iteration of this is Project 2025. And the documentary talks about the strategy that was laid out, that the goal was to take over what they called these 7 mountains, the 7 areas of society, right? this movement wanted to take over and control our education system, our government, our banks, media. And I forget what all 7 of them were, but those were at least some of them. And that's what you're seeing in Project 2025 to some extent. To eliminate the Department of Education means to eliminate any kind of check and balance on what is taught in our schools. And if you can indoctrinate our children, well, who's going to stand in the way of that if you do not have a Department of Education? The takeover of government agencies, the consolidation of all the agencies that deal with immigration so that you can have a different, more hostile immigration policy. Those are right out of that playbook. And so the Heritage Foundation has been at this for decades and has just, I think, grown in prominence and in power in that time. We need to educate people about what does Project 2025 mean? What are the implications of that for your life, for your neighbors' lives? How does that impede your ability and your neighbor's ability to flourish, as you talked about earlier? And then we need to encourage people to vote, because although what you're saying is we ought not to marry politics and government, that does not mean we should not vote our values.
That's right. 1,000%. That is exactly right. And there's a difference, right? There's a difference. The difference is what and who is in the driver's seat, right? When your faith is in the driver's seat of the government writ large, there are a few things that means can't happen. That means that there are people who won't be represented because they don't share the same faith you do. But here's one thing I do know. There are people who don't share the same faith I do, whose faith calls them to the same values I hold.
Right. And there are people who don't practice any particular faith who also share those values.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so where are we putting faith in the driver's seat? Which car is faith driving? Faith needs to drive the car of my life. My faith drives the car of my life. My faith does not drive the car of your life.
Well, Kristen, thanks for a really good conversation about Project 2025. I'm really looking forward to a lot of these other topics that we're going to be discussing, some of which we touched on today. I mean, we've got a whole season coming up of some really interesting issues like immigration and bodily autonomy and whatever else we decide we're going to talk about. So stay tuned.
Thanks for being part of the Christian in Name Only community. As much as we love the sound of our own voices, we'd love to hear yours even more. So remember to like, subscribe, share, and comment on the pod. Sign up for our emails, and let's continue the conversation together.